Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's jointly hosted webinar by myself, Samantha Manning of Searches UK, and today we're joined by Neil Wood from Future Climate Info. Can I please double check that you can all hear me? If you can you kindly send me a message in the chat or the questions pane just to let me know that you can hear me clearly? Also, just to let you know that if you do have any questions during the webinar, by all means, you can write your questions in the chat pane, or you can write your messages or questions in the questions pane, and myself or Neil will be more than happy to contact you after the webinar. We will give you our details so that you can contact us, and we'll answer any questions you may have. Also, just to make you aware, the webinar is being recorded live. So what we will do is after the webinar, you'll all get a copy of the recording once the session has ended. For now, what I'll do is hand over to Neil, but thank you all so much for attending.
Yeah, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the latest in a series of webinars in association with Searches UK and me from Future Climate Info. So my background is Senior Business Development Manager. Future Climate Info is an environmental report provider, been in the market now since 2014, so not new by any means. So you're probably comfortable with Landmark and Groundshaw for environmental reports. Today we're going to go over a selection of reports in and around the new build plot compliance subject area, which is what we're all looking at today. So I'm going to go through a few case studies and a few things that you're going to be able to take away and hopefully remember. So there's me. So if you've come across me before, hello again. And hopefully when the world gets back open again, we can start to see each other at conferences and exhibitions again, and we can chat some of these topic areas through. We've got quite a detailed agenda. I've crammed as much into this as I possibly can. Got quite a few case studies and news clips for you, just so that you can have as much ammunition as possible to relay back to your clients. So we're going to have a look at the legacy of the ground and the remediation practices that we've put in place. We're going to look at the new build owner liabilities, all the case studies that I've put together. So there's one in Bradford, one in Darwin, Lancashire, one in New Bern, which is up in the northeast, so quite spread. And we're going to have a look at the FCI reports and what types of reports they are. So thank you very much to Searches UK for allowing me to present to you today. And we're going to start by looking at a bit of legacy, really. We all know we've had a big industrial legacy here in the UK, rich industrial heritage, so going back to the 1800s of the Industrial Revolution. And we've got a hell of a lot of land in this country that is potentially contaminated, as you would imagine. There's a lot of things been buried intentionally. There's a lot of things that have been spilt over unintentionally, or maybe even intentionally poured into watercourses and drains and so on over that time. Certainly we were heavily unregulated in regards to contamination at the time because it was relatively unknown. Obviously we're well aware of all the potential contaminants in the soils now, with all the data that we can harness and we can channel into these reports that you rely upon every day. That's why we do them. I think there's an estimated 225,000 potentially contaminated sites here in the UK still, and it's still an enormous problem. One of the reasons it's such an enormous problem is we've got local authorities, which you probably well know, are understaffed, poorly resourced, not got a lot of money. So they can't go out doing those soil tests and soil samples and anything of that nature as much as they're used to or as much as they'd like to. So we're sort of stuck in an area where we haven't really got much regeneration of old contaminated land. From a local authority point of view, probably none at all. So the only way we can get around this is what we're talking about today, is new build. The only people with any money are the developers. So they get offered land extremely cheaply on the understanding that they will redevelop that land, and if they come across any potential contamination, it's their duty and obligation to clear that contamination up. That's how it should, in theory, work, because we obviously need to redevelop as much of our brownfield land as we possibly can without sort of encroaching onto the green belt land that we have in and around our major towns and cities, which is what the government are extremely keen to try and avoid. So we've got a lot of issues in regards to industry. I mean, for example, the cotton industry, heavily located around the northwest, certainly around Manchester and Blackburn, where I came from and grew up. A lot of cotton mills there. And the reason that cotton was situated in the northwest, I only found out recently, was because it's, well, I say extremely damp. It's pretty damp, and I think cotton likened itself to a more damp environment to be manufactured, and ultimately that's why Manchester was chosen. Apparently, we've got a lot of potential contamination around industrial ports. So you've got your Newcastle, Sunderlands, Liverpool, certainly major industrial ports. And then you have the canals and waterways which take that industrial commerce to places like Leeds and Manchester. So, there's a heavily contaminated areas, certainly around those ports. So that's one to bear in mind as well. And looking at the Coal Authority data, how much of the UK's population live above abandoned mines? I mean, this is quite a surprising stat. It's 1 in 4. So this is why we still sort of do environmental reports and still get Coal Authority reports or Coal Authority information from one of the various suppliers out in the market, of which FCI are one of them, is to protect you and your clients from these hidden perils. And looking at the coal mining landscape, you can see various different maps on screen. The one on the left-hand side is your coal mining, and that's pretty much well ingrained in our minds as to where the coal mines are in this country. We've been looking at maps like this for generations now, so we know that South Wales is prevalent, certainly the Midlands and the northwest of the country. Yorkshire's heavily mined, and up into the northeast as well. And that's sort of where mining has started and stopped in regards to environmental reports. But more recently, it's got a lot more detailed. We're now looking for all different types of mining and minerals. So you've got things like limestone in Birmingham, you've got chalk in London and Reading and places like that. So suddenly you can't build everywhere that you thought you could. Due diligence has got to take place to an enormous extent to avoid potential pitfalls and properties collapsing into sinkholes and all sorts of things that you're hearing about in the news. And you've got companies like Terra Firma specialising in all the different types of mining and minerals that are available in this country. And that's opening the eyes of lenders and insurance companies more and more now as to what is likely to be claimed on, where you can likely build and where you can't. What we've got is an interactive Coal Authority map. I don't know if you've ever looked at this. So it's the similar areas that we were looking at on the previous slide, and you can type in any location into that and have a little look around. We're going to focus on a town called Chorley. This is sort of just north of Manchester and Bolton and just shy of Preston. It's on the edge of the coal mining seam, which you can see in black on there. So you can see there we've got the first layer on screen, which is showing up there as the mine entries. So what looks like clear fields and clear opportunities for new build development, suddenly you're having to avoid all these potential pitfalls, which are all over the region. And in this area, it's heavily involved. And as you start overlaying different data sets, so we've got development in high risk now. So all those shaded black areas, serpent-like, all over the region, are areas that you really shouldn't be building on or anywhere near for the reasons that you could have subsidence claims, you could have houses collapsing. So new build developments need to avoid these sorts of areas. And I've got a case study where they really didn't avoid that area, and it was pretty catastrophic in the end with the end results. Then we overlay on top of that past shallow coal mine workings and probable shallow coal mine workings on top in purple. So you can start to see an area that was full of countryside suddenly isn't. And this is what developers have got to avoid, and it's extremely difficult for them to do that. So they try and take whatever lands that they can and hope that they can develop it to a point where they don't collapse, because the land they might get might be cheap. They might think we can get them built, get them turned over, get our money and get out of there. Fingers crossed that everything will be okay, really. The Coal Authority, if they do get any subsidence or collapses on any of these sites you can see, will remediate the land and put it right effectively. So if a property did collapse, they would get it underpinned or they would replace it. That is part of their agreement. But if a property does subside or collapse as a result of any other type of mine, so if it was a chalk mine, for example, there'd be no obligation on the coal authority to remediate that for you, and that would fall on the homeowner. So I'm going to talk to you in a little bit about what we can do in those situations. But here we've got a case study which you can find on Future Climate Info's website address. This is an incident in Newcastle. This is where there was a Bayfield estate. This is in North Tyneside in 2011, part of quite a large development, where several properties were found to be shifting, moving, cracking, and ultimately was fear of collapse. And the coal authority set up a base on the estate and carried out detailed examination for 14 months. Their investigation revealed unrecorded coal mine workings, which dated back about 120 years. These showed that this site was extensively worked. Okay, usually in an area, 45 to 50% of coal is mined. In this particular area, though, there was over 70%. And in January 2017, 5 properties on the estate were demolished, and a further 10 were scheduled for demolition after that, costing nearly £100,000, with a total housing development loss at about £3 million. So you can certainly look this case study up on various news articles as well. I think that it's still going. There's obviously a huge amount of disruption, huge amount of upset for anyone who ever bought a property on this site. They obviously fear blight because everybody now knows that the Bayfield estate has been underpinned or some have been demolished. So will they ever sell their properties? And this is all on new build estates. So you can't think, oh, is there a point really getting an environmental report because it's a new build property? There's a very good chance that they could fall victim in this case, just like any other. So the Coal Authority, as I mentioned, under the Coal Mining Subsidence Act 91, has got liability for historical coal mining subsidence claims. The shallow mine workings were not documented in this case by the Coal Authority, and the risks weren't evident during their preliminary due diligence. So that was a major problem. They'd recorded certain amounts of shallow coal workings, but not all of them were recorded. And that's the big problem in this country, is there's, for every one recorded mine working, they think there's another 1 or 2 in the area that are unrecorded. So it literally is a minefield. So looking at an FCI report, we have got our CON29M status. So if you want to get an official coal report, you can get one from FCI. This is what it looks like. And we have the mine entry interpretation report, that used to be about £120, £130. We put in there for free at no extra cost. And effectively, if you're within 20 metres of a mine entry, you would typically have had to have been referred to the Coal Authority for a further report, well over £100. And we've managed to put one of those in there if you're unfortunate enough to be that close as part and parcel of the report. So you can certainly ask Samantha for further details after the presentation. And as you can see, we've got various different key subject areas that we cover. And we've got some insurance features within the report. And what that means effectively is, you might have heard of Cheshire Brine, for example. That's in the northwest of England. And we've got a full indemnity against that should you ever get a subsidence claim as a result, covered in the report. Also, if there's any subsidence caused by any other mineral other than coal, we will cover the property for an indemnity of up to £100,000 worth of work. Now, as I mentioned before, the Coal Authority are obliged with any subsidence claim regarding to coal workings, but they are not obliged to do anything about non-coal workings. So if it's on their register, if it's on their mapping, and it's the subsidence as a result, our report will cover for any subsidence claims as part and parcel of that report. So that's really important. No one else in the industry does this. So we'll just mention that. Certainly in terms of new properties, as you can imagine, last year there wasn't as many new properties built with COVID and all the restrictions that we've suffered. So only 110,000 properties were completed in England last year. And in the recent Queen's speech, the government were announcing to build 300,000 new build properties. So that's an extremely large amount, and it's something that we haven't done in this country probably before, or certainly for decades. 65% of these homes constructed on former industrial brownfield sites, the likes of which we talked about right at the beginning, which is part of the National Planning Policy Framework, the NPPF, which encourages new build on brownfield sites first, wherever possible. And you can imagine new build developers are crying out for greenbelt land because they know that there's no contamination there, and they want to build there so that effectively they can pull their money straight out when the houses sell and move on. Who wants delays? Nobody. So they certainly don't want further actions or potential contamination or having to dig down several meters deeper because they know contamination spread widely. They want that eats into their profit margin. They don't want to build there ideally. So that is why there's this massive pressure in the market at the moment. And as I'll go on to in a few slides' time, the building on floodplains as well. Again, they've not been built on before. Guess what? Floodplains are flat as well, aren't they? So they've got a lot less work to do. So developers, all they want to do is get their houses built, get them built quick, pull their profits out immediately. They don't want any of these entanglements. You can understand why. But it definitely is brownfield first. There's a lot more brownfield land worth developing, certainly in the south and southeast, as the value of that land increases. The further north you go, it becomes less attractive to developers. And there is, in fact, a case in Rochdale where the local authority were trying to get rid of some land they knew was contaminated to a developer. They didn't want it, and ultimately they ended up putting a solar farm on top of it. So they actually, because they couldn't put a spade in the ground effectively, because that would have created a source pathway receptor situation, and contamination that was down underneath the ground would have had a means of escape. So they thought, well, let's put something on top of the land instead. And they put the solar farm on there to generate wealth for the local authority, which you could understand why. And it's the first of its kind I've ever read about. So that was about 6 or 7 years ago. And literally, if you start looking for these sorts of articles, you'll find them every week. So assault on the green belt, so nearly 400,000 homes will be built on rural land. And again, south of England, it's where property prices are the highest. So you can appreciate why developers want to build there. It's more bang for their buck. If they're building 3 or 4 bedroom properties in the south, they can command a higher price. So they've got the 300,000 new build properties per year until 2025, which is extremely ambitious. So local authorities are under massive pressure to release land quickly, because otherwise they're not going to meet their own individual targets. And that is why ultimately greenbelt land and floodplains are being released to these developers, because the local authorities can't find the land anywhere else, or they can't release it quick enough. It's a real massive problem. So we've got common misconceptions to look at now, and we've mentioned a few of these. With modern construction practices and stringent planning processes in the UK, new and recent housing developments will have been constructed to an appropriate standard, which they should be. So from a developer, they will do the absolute bare minimum to get it up to the current rectified standards. They're probably not doing enough at the moment, developers, to future-proof these properties. I think if there's contamination found or the house floods in 20, 30 years, is the developer really going to be that bothered about it? Because they've got their money, they've moved on, and in most cases probably gone out of business long, long before then. So really their interest is for the next few years rather than decades, I would imagine. And ultimately we're looking to see whether the homeowner can be liable for contamination, and there's a misconception that we can't be, but we can. There's no guarantee that a new home will not be subject to contamination. I've got a couple of case study examples where this is the case. New builds do suffer from contamination issues just as much as anywhere else. And when we're looking to pin the blame, if you like, on anyone to clear up the mess that is left from contamination. We've got two types of people, or two classes of people. We've got Class A. These are the people that have knowingly caused or knowingly permitted contamination to exist in the first place. So you've got like all those old industrial businesses, for example, or gas works or petrol stations and things like that. Knowingly permitted. So if you owned, for example, a gas works or a petrol station, and you knew contamination was happening, or you knew they were intentionally tipping things into local watercourses, you're still a Class A person. You knew it was happening and did nothing about it. Class A person will be the developer as well. Everyone else falls into Class B. So that's people like me and you, owner occupiers of our properties. So if the blame cannot be passed to a Class A person because they've gone out of business perhaps, the only people left to clear up contamination is us. So this is what can happen, and why environmental reports are so important, because you need to know whether there's an issue there or not. Case study for you. Contaminated land one. You don't tend to get them hitting the news, nowhere near like flood ones. Flood are hitting the news pretty much every month these days. This is a case in Chepstow. This is between England and Wales. Outline planning permission was 450 brand new homes on an old shipyard. So you can only imagine what has been going on over the 100 years plus that site had been in operation. Many things spilt, tipped, and buried over that time. And as you can imagine, contamination was found. You had your arsenics, your mercuries, many other metals found in the soils that they needed to eradicate. And this was a development that was ongoing. So if you can squint, you can probably see the date on that article. That was February 2019. And they had to keep monitoring. They had to do the gas monitoring. They had to keep doing their soil sampling and testing. And the developer, Barratt Homes in this case, would have had to have done all that throughout the whole course of the development. You can only imagine that they got the land extremely cheaply, on the understanding that they would remediate the land and clear it from contaminants along the way, which they did, and did successfully in this case. I followed the case through in February this year. It was pretty much finished. So they've opened the doors on what they've called the Brunel Quarter now. So if you know it or from that area, you'll be able to see that in action. So it's right next to the river. So I pray that they've done the full due diligence on it as well. So can a new build owner ever be a Class A? Yes, is the answer. If you alter the property, the construction of a house on top of contamination obviously establishes a link between contamination and the future residents, which previously didn't exist. The developer is obviously considered a Class A person because they're causing a link to exist by digging foundations and digging down to what is potentially buried in that soil. However, if the new homeowner alters the property or the grounds in some way, exposing contamination, they can be a causer in exactly the same way. So also can be a Class A person and be responsible for clear-up costs. Yes, also by being a knowing permitter. It's not uncommon for developers to disclose contamination information during the conveyancing process. This can be deemed awareness by the buyer of the existence of that contamination, and if they fail to remediate it, they could also be a knowing permitter, so therefore defaulting into Class A as well. So really interesting. Something that you're going to find in every single FCI report now that's got a pass for residential is something called a remediation warranty. Really important, because if we pass a particular plot, so let's say the one we've just seen in Chepstow, we give you £100,000 guaranteed for 6 years from the date of purchase if contamination actually rears its head. So let's say that we passed it, all the information we had suggested it was okay. The people move in, the gardens stop growing, or things start dying or turning black or something like that. There's obviously contamination there of some description. And what this would do is cover in the event that the developer has since gone bust. So if the original polluter's gone bust, which in most cases they will have done many years ago, if the developer's subsequently gone bust, if it was, for example, a smaller developer, then there'd be no one left to pick up the cost other than the homeowner. So because we based our report evaluation on incorrect material unbeknown to us, we offer a warranty. So if within 6 years that does happen, £100,000 is to basically dig out the topsoils and subsoils, eradicate all the potential contaminants and replace those topsoils back. Okay, so it's quite a significant amount of time. Nobody else in the market does it for that length of time or guarantees it. We have no excess to pay either, so it's pretty much market leading. And here's a classic case study for you to show you where that would have been actually prevalent. This is a site where tungsten batteries was in place. This is Market Harbour in Leicestershire, if you know it. They manufactured car batteries for 75 years. Very lead and sulfuric acid environment. They handled over 25,000 gallons of sulfuric acid every week. Multiple accidents, leakages, and so on. The site was closed about 20 years ago now, and a new Bellway Homes housing development was put on its place. And here we've got the site here. When it was cleared, you can see the aerial photography. And remediation was carried out to the correct specified standard by the developer. The local authority came and inspected it and was very happy with it, and the homes were built. The area in the top northwest corner where the green circles are, they noticed that their gardens weren't growing and things were dying, and they couldn't work out what was going on. So they called the local authority, who did the investigation work, found out that their soils were contaminated. And what had happened in this case was those two circles represented the vats of sulfuric acid that were held on site. What happened here was one of those vats leaked into the drains and the soils, and it was never reported. So the problem with it being never reported was the local authority and the developer never knew to dig down deeper in that area to eradicate that contamination. So what happened when the rains came, it increased the water table. The water table pushed the impurities back up through the soil to the surface, and there they go. It's now contaminated. And so luckily enough for us, Bellway Homes still in business. They came and eradicated the soils of I think it was up to 10 properties in that northwest corner, eradicated the problem, replenished the soils and made good. So ultimately that was a happy ending. If it would have been a developer that had since gone bust or liquidated that business entity in the meantime, the only people left to clear up that cost effectively is the homeowner. And that is where that remediation warranty would have kicked in. So that £100,000 would have kicked in. You could submit in your FCI report and that money would have cleared that up at no cost to the homeowner, which is ultimately the situation you want. So can a Class B person become liable? I think we'll just explain that really. Developers unfortunately established these special purpose vehicles, SPVs they're called, and they act as a legal entity responsible for the construction, and this limits their liability and protects the holding company. So what happens more than often is they liquidate these companies not far after development's complete, just in case this sort of thing happens. So if you're trying to pin blame on them a year or two down the line, there's a good chance they've liquidated their company and that part of Bellway Homes doesn't exist anymore. Tough luck. And then you're stuck. All you've got is the warranty, or if you haven't got an environmental report, unfortunately, it's going to come out of your pocket. And that's why new builds are just as dangerous for contaminated land as anything else, because of this very fact. So we've looked at in part one, the fact that most of the UK is affected by historical mining, oil and gas wells. The full extent we'll probably never know because it's buried under the ground. It's a very subjective risk. We've looked at regeneration and new builds, largely on brownfield sites, 65% as we saw. So the risk of contaminated land is very high. The new build property owner can become liable by altering the property or becoming a known permitter. And where remediation is required, developers will often look for the most cost-effective solution. As I say, they haven't got much sort of foresight to be looking into the future to sort this problem out long term. And it's vital that as conveyancers, you're able to access comprehensive, robust environmental search data that's going to highlight these risks before people buy. There's that misconception that because it's a new build, I'm not going to encounter any of these risks. You are. And case studies furthermore, just to go into a little bit more detail on this. One or two of these you might have even come across. This is quite a recent, and in fact, it's an ongoing case study, this one. So this is an area that in Bradford was used for coal mining more than 150 years previously. The mine shut and the adjacent land was used for landfill, contained industrial, commercial, household waste. And what's happened is we've got a property here, it's in Rewley Croft, Odsall, near the rugby ground, as you can see on the picture on the top. So this is at the end of the M606 as you come off the M62. I know it quite well, and right at the top of there on the left-hand side, you'll see this particular site. Now, the landfill itself, there's no detailed record of what materials or chemicals had actually been dumped and stored in there. And as you can see from the picture, it's a nice, clean-looking green field at the back of these new build properties. So to the naked eye and to the uneducated person buying them, they would think, great, bought a new property with cracking views, and I shouldn't have any problems whatsoever. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case. And these properties were featured on Rip Off Britain. And Chris and Steph Oliver bought a 3-bedroom house for £130,000 in 2014. In 2019, they went to remortgage the property only to discover a zero valuation. And this was due to the absence of a final lawful building certificate. This is now the case for all 13 properties. Sherwood Homes didn't respond, who were the developer, for any approaches by the residents or the authorities. And the issue that they've got is that landfill should have had a membrane to it, which goes underneath the properties, which stops any particular gas emission reaching the property, which could be ignited, obviously, within the property and causing serious issues. And the local authority, when challenged, couldn't find any evidence, even though it was signed off, that the membrane had been put in place. Sherwood Homes has gone out of business and they weren't answering any calls, so they couldn't document any evidence it had been done either. And because there's no evidence it's been done, you can understand why a mortgage lender wouldn't lend or remortgage on it. And this is still the case even today. They still haven't resolved this problem. They still can't work out what's going on. And without sort of doing excavation holes and boreholes and things, I don't know how they're going to resolve it or who's going to pay for it. The local authority are going to have some elements of responsibility and probably going to have to contribute, but I dare say the homeowners are going to end up rooting in the pockets as well. So this is a real devastating end to the story, especially, you know, that the tenants themselves might not have the money. And how do you find the money if you can't remortgage? So they're in a massive catch-22 situation. And Mr. and Mrs. Oliver did complain to their conveyancers, who denied negligence, but agreed to contribute some money towards bringing the estate up to standard. So these are headaches you just don't need. So if you get an environmental report, it would clearly say in an FCI situation that it is further action, and I'll show you that in a minute. So this is me going onto Google. I literally took some images just to show you that if you drove down there, you'd have absolutely no idea of the perils that lied beneath. And there's some, you know, really expensive properties, you know, on the next street, for example, that could have been liable as well. So it's a really interesting position. You've got Sherwood Homes. I went back through their Twitter feed, and this is them advertising the properties back in 2014, but they're no longer in existence anymore, and you'd understand why. If they hadn't put that membrane in, they probably wouldn't want to be responsible for having to do something about it. It would cost them hundreds of thousands of pounds, more than likely. So the issue that we've got in a more pictorial form. So even though the site hadn't been used for 40 years, it remained a risk of that methane and carbon dioxide, as I mentioned, being released from underground and migrating to those buildings nearby. In 1986, there was a news article about a bungalow in Derbyshire completely destroyed by landfill gas, effectively. So how was this granted by Bradford Council? So one of the key planning conditions was the effective remediation of the site before a valid building certificate could be issued. Sherwood Homes was required to fit that layer of membrane to prevent any gas escaping into the properties. Evidence of that correct installation was lacking, and the final building compliance certificate were never issued. So it begs the question, why on earth did these people ever move in? I literally took an environmental report to this location and chose a property on that street, and guess what? It further actioned as it should. And you can see the brown entity on the right-hand side is the landfill, and the property backs up to it, literally. So we would have asked you in the legal space to contact the local authority, building control, planning office, to see whether these were remediated correctly and have you got the building certificates. And they obviously couldn't produce them, so therefore it would have remained a further action, and anyone getting an FCI report would have got appropriate insurance in place. So if this did occur, at least they would be covered. I can only presume many of these people, if not all of them, haven't got any indemnity against it. So there's been a massive problem there. And looking into the report, you can see where it mentions section 1.16 and 1.18. You've got landfill, which I clearly showed you in the last diagram, and you've got past industrial land uses mentioned on there as well, which is a heap with unknown constituents, high severity, distance 0 meters, because it butts up to the property at the back. So it couldn't be clearer in the report what you should be asking about and what to do about it. So now we've got a huge blame trail. So you've got the developer, Sherwood Homes, so they're first in line, obviously. If they didn't fit the membrane at all or didn't fit it properly, how was it discharged to meet the planning conditions? So they should be culpable, but they're not in business, obviously, anymore. So therefore, we can't pin the blame on them. So then you've got the landfill operator. The former owners were landfill operators 4 decades previously, again, not operating anymore. So you can't pin the blame on them. The council obviously do exist. They should have been more rigorous in pursuing enforcement action against Sherwood Homes for the conditions. So we've got a dilemma now of who pays for all this. Will the council stomach the cost, some of the cost, none of the cost? And will it be passed on to those homeowners? So that is a case study ongoing. You can keep Googling it and see if any resolution takes place in the coming weeks and months. Another case study we've got, again, this is going on at the moment. This is Darwin near Blackburn in the northwest. There's a nuclear risk on this one, as well as coal mining, so it's a real mixed bag. So there's 150,000 abandoned mine entries, representing 25,000 square kilometres of tunnels across the UK, and that's recorded by the Coal Authority. And importantly, there's many additional unrecorded mines that are also there that we're building on top of, unbeknownst to us and the developers. And Blackburn and Darwin Council have given the go-ahead, unbelievably, for a development site at Bailey's Field for an improved access with the completion of a new road involved. McDermott Homes are planning 343 new properties on this site. Local councillors have warned of the presence of up to 10 mine shafts on here. 2 were revealed actually during the construction of a new road. So those probably weren't really documented that well. So following heavy winter rains, a sinkhole has appeared on the site. And again, many of these are unmapped and they could be taking you by surprise. The 2 types of mine shafts that we've got the mine shafts that are on the Coal Authority's records, but you've also got the ventilation shafts which just aren't on there. And there could be an additional 10 to 20 of those unknowns on that site. Each shaft has got to be located though, it's got to be capped, given a 20-metre buffer. Wimpy Homes had a 500 home development plan for this site in 2000, 20 years ago, and they withdrew, and you can probably understand why. And like I said earlier in the presentation, for every known mine entry, there's going to be at least 2 more unrecorded in the local vicinity because they just weren't that good at recording them at the time. And then there's the nuclear risk, just to compound the problem that they've got here. So there was a lot of nuclear waste dumped here in the 1950s. And as Julie mentions on here, there was no formal regulation at the time, so it's unclear of the exact location, the amount and what it contains. But there could be up to 900 tons of nuclear waste dumped in mine shafts around here, okay, which is an absolute nightmare. Local residents have launched a petition against the housing estate, and so you really have to do your due diligence on this. If you start to see further actions and Coal Authority issues all over this site, it might not be prudent to advise your client goes ahead. And I literally took this less than 2 weeks ago off the McDermott Homes website, that they're delighted to announce a brand new development coming soon. And to anyone who's completely ignorant to all of these issues would go ahead no problem and wouldn't understand what the risks involved are. And it's up to us to try and demystify it so you're a little bit more knowledgeable than they are. Case study number 3 is a flood one, and this is one in Newburn up in the northeast near Newcastle, just to the west of. and they had a torrential amount of rain. I think it was a month or two's worth in 2 or 3 hours. And this was in summer, believe it or not. This was, I think it was 28th of June, 2012, off the top of my head. And it was called Thunder Thursday at the time. It was where two hot and cold air fronts met, and they put literally a 1 in 200 year rainfall event down on a location. And this is the devastation that can sort of ensue as a result. I've got a video to show you in a minute, but you can see it's washed away all the land underneath this property. This is a new build property, 6 years old. It's propped up by its pile foundations, you can see on the right hand side. That was a car park in front of it, which couldn't take the weight of the water. Literally, when you've got that much water draining down, it was through a really narrow area. The weight of the water just capsized the whole lot. And you can see just on the right hand side there's a culvert which was underneath the land. That should have told the developer something, that water naturally drained through this area well before they decided to build on it. So this property got too dangerous, as you can appreciate, for anyone to even go back in and rescue their belongings. So you know, flood is devastating. So the owner occupiers of every single property in that block could not go back in there and retrieve anything. And it was actually demolished. That is how bad it was. And so anyone who thinks, oh, I don't need a flood report on a brand new build, I think that just puts it to the sword, really. Even worse is people who think, well, I'm on the first floor flat, what do I need a flood report for? Well, you need to know whether the ground floor floods as well, and whether the surrounding land's going to impact you, because it's pretty devastating. You know, you might not get your kids to school, you might not, you know, be able to get to work, or worse still, can't get home after being to work because of something flooding in and around your property. So if I can play this for you, you'll be able to see the aerial photography as the helicopter spins round. And I've been to that site as well. It's probably the safest place in the world to build right now, because they've underpinned it and solidified that earth so much that it's safe now. But I did a report on this at the time, and the surface water mapping was absolutely spot on. It was a bit serpent-like, and it was all pixelated, but that is exactly where the rainwater went, collected, and that's the devastation it caused. So there's the pile foundations holding the building up, and it's like Niagara Falls in the car park. So it's extremely devastating. And when we talk about 1 in 100 year rainfall events, it doesn't mean that they occur every 100 years. Ultimately, let me get out of that. It's like a horse, for example, that's 100 to 1. Yeah, most weeks it's going to come last, but one day it's going to wake up, it's going to have suitable conditions to race in, it's going to enjoy its breakfast, and suddenly out of the blue it wins. And then 4 days later, guess what? The conditions are exactly the same, and it wins again. And that is like a 1 in 100 flood event. It doesn't mean they happen every 100 years. It could mean you get them twice in a week. It's just unfortunate. And our mapping shows what happens in those worst case eventualities so that you can prepare for it. It's no good saying, well, I've lived here all my life, or I've lived here 40 years and it's never flooded. Sorry, unless you're about 200 years old, you really don't know and understand what the perils of flood are. And we've got here classic news article last year, 1 in 10 new homes in England are built on land with high flood risk. Like I said before, developers really don't care if it floods many years down the line, because they've long gone. So ultimately, they will try their best not to build in the worst areas or worst floodplain areas, but ultimately they want a return on their money, so they will build in these areas. And then we've got government statistics, spending 5.2 billion reducing flooding in England over the next 6 years. This is an article I literally took last week. The Environment Agency are going to spend 860 million next year to support more than 1,000 schemes, with significant funds in Yorkshire, Humber and the North West regions that have been hit hard in recent years. This is quite an interesting paragraph. Ministers also announced tighter guidance to deter building of new homes in flood-prone areas, and changes to a government-backed insurance scheme to allow flooded homeowners to be paid to better protect their homes. So they're acknowledging the fact that properties are built in areas they really shouldn't be, and they're trying to allow government-backed insurance schemes to actually make better provision against flood rather than stopping them being built there in the first place more than often. So we're going to have a little look now at types of reports that are on offer through Searches UK. What you can see is our residential suite in front of you. The only difference between them is the content sets on the front. So you can see on the left-hand side, we've got the FCI Essential, and it's called the Essential because the Law Society Practice Notes talks about contaminated land and flood as a basic, and that's the content sets we put in there. We don't do screening reports, so we don't give you a contaminated land report and then say, oh, you might need flood or you might need energy and infrastructure or HS2. If you want that, that's what you pay for. We found that law firms got frustrated. They thought they were being upsold to all the time. So we don't put screening reports in, and that was on feedback from people like yourself who didn't want it. So the standard adds ground stability, which talks about the type of rock or the type of soil that your property is built on. So for example, there's a lot of clay soils in the south of the country, and they will have what's known as shrink and swell. So in the winter, clay holds water, so it will be saturated, and summers like this where it's very dry, they literally compact, and therefore you get the shrinking and swelling, which causes cracks and subsidence. And 2018, 3 years ago, when we had that really hot summer, there was the most insurance subsidence claims that there'd been in well over a decade, and that is because of that. And in the ground stability section, we identify that as a potential source of an issue. Obviously, we can't tell from a desktop report whether the individual property's got an issue. That is down to a surveyor doing their job. We move on then to the premium, which includes energy and infrastructure, which is your wind farms, your solar farms, nuclear power stations, fracking, things of that nature. So if you're in and amongst those sorts of risks, it might be prevalent to get that report. And we've included planning as well. Planning has become more and more interesting as time's gone by. You want to know what's happening in and around your chosen property and whether there's any new properties scheduled to be built in and around. If it's a city, we search 250 metres. If it's a town, 500 metres. Rural location, 750 metres. So we try and capture as much information as we can, because obviously in a rural location, we don't want anything to affect the trunk roads that you use to get to work. And if there is something going to be built, you don't want noise, dust, vibration, lorries, disruption in that time. And importantly, it's going to be putting more cars on the road as well if it is a new housing development. So people want to know about these things. We've got commercial reports as well, FCI Commercial, FCI Retail. If you've never heard of FCI Retail before, if you're doing transactions on takeaways, shops, coffee bars, things like that, you don't need to spend 200 odd pounds on an environmental report. The FCI Retail is perfect for that, £75 plus VAT. So I'd again ask Samantha at Searches UK to discuss that with you. It's the only report of its type in the marketplace, and it's perfect for anything that's on the high street, town centres, city centres, covers you for contaminated land, flood and ground stability. We all know that shops flood just as easily as houses do, and you know, someone would be pretty upset if they've moved into a shop and 6 months later they flooded when you could have told them for 75 quid. I'm sure they'd be banging on your door wanting to know why. And 40% of all businesses like that never reopen after a major flood event. So it's important that we can tell them right at the beginning. So how can you as a conveyancer protect your client? Well, it's important that you get an environmental search you can rely upon with up-to-date data sets and how to communicate further actions to them. I do more in-depth webinars on further actions if you want to hear one of those, and we'll go through a few more case study examples. If you get a further action alert, what you're going to do about it. If your property's new, like what we're talking about today, invariably they might have an NHBC certificate or similar, which discharges all the planning conditions, and then if there is any potential issue, we can rely upon that. You need to make sure that you've gone to the local authority if we've given you a further action. Speak to the various departments, the environmental team, the planning team, the building control teams as necessary to see whether they've got any particular issues with the site and any reason why it shouldn't proceed. Can we evaluate a whole site so I don't get any more further actions on the same plot? Because invariably you guys will be doing more than just one property on a given location. Generally, when we receive information that relates to a new build, we will try and pass the entire site at the same time. But to do that, we require the decision notice and subsequent discharge of conditions relating to the contaminated land conditions. The evidence has got to be conclusive, and it's got to be appropriate to the works that have been conducted for us to pass the whole lot. If a council does confirm that the appropriate works have been carried out for the development, and would likely then be looking at the pass situation. If for whatever reason we can't pass the site, the team will review what information that we have got, and we'll look at it on an individual basis to see whether we can pass that one property, and we'll do our best to get it over the line. So we've got an expert chartered team of environmental professionals within our midst, so we will certainly help and review where we can. There's a couple of extra items that you could use us for. There's an FCI appraisal, FCI accredited, and a walk around as well. An appraisal is if, for example, you've got a commercial property, you don't have the time to really gather all the information yourself. We will do it for you. We'll speak to the Environment Agency, all the regulators, we'll speak to the local authorities, we'll document all of our conversations, emails, who we spoke to and when, and then we'll give you an overall summary, whether it's a pass or we're going to uphold the further action. Walk around is if an inspection is required on any particular site that you come across, and we can look to how they're storing materials, who the neighbours are you up or downstream from them, and it can actually reduce indemnity premiums that are paid quite often. So in summary, we now understand sort of a lot more of the risks to new build than maybe we did before. The need for thorough due diligence to be done, and we can't take it for granted that everything has been done successfully. Much of the UK, as we know, is affected by historical legacies of coal mining. New build developments are largely on brownfield sites, as we mentioned, so risk of contamination is high. Where remediation is required, developers will often look for the most cost-effective solution rather than the most long-standing solutions. And it's vital that as a conveyancer, you're able to access comprehensive, robust environmental search information, which we put in our reports so that you can allow your client to make a suitable decision. And the suite of reports we've just gone through, we do detailed analysis on further action and hope that we can help you evaluate it. And certainly I would say that 90% of all your reports should pass first time for contaminated land. I think it's 85% of all our reports pass for flood. We do offer a further action flood report, and that is done by Ashfields, who are a consultant. We don't make money on the back of that. That is literally a professional looking at your property specifically, and they will look for all sorts of things to try and overturn that further action back to a pass. I think out of the 15% that are further action, 55% subsequently pass when these reports are taken, because they do everything in their power to overturn it. So it could well be that they look for back doors, front doors, air bricks, see whether water can penetrate. They look to see whether you've got steps up to your front door. They look to see whether you've got a sloping driveway up or down, if you're in a first floor flat, if your neighbour's built a wall that could potentially push flood water away. They look at the depth of flood water. So if the depth of flood water is 20 centimetres and your front door is 30 centimetres, then they'll say that all the grounds of the property are going to flood, but your house won't. So all those sorts of analysis is taking place. So it's well worth further discussion. So thanks very much for listening to us this morning. My details are on screen if you've got further information you'd like. Samantha's on screen as well if you want information on the FCI reports, what to do if you want to look at putting a pack together that includes different types of information. Please do get in touch. But really appreciate that. I'm sure there's more webinars that we can roll out to you. Any specific subject area you feel that you would like, let Samantha know. I'm sure we can put something together. But enjoy the rest of your day, and thanks very much for listening.